Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Unit 4 in the series, and look forward to working with you during this short session of an hour. So we're well and truly through the series now. We've got another 2 modules to go apart from this one, and today we're going to be looking at getting the very best out of people, which is obviously something that we all hope to do when we're actually leading people. It's not quite as simple as we might think, and those of us who have been in leadership roles for a period of time would realise that it's quite a complex subject. So I want to lead you through a few different theories and models that might help you to gain a greater insight into what makes people tick and how you might utilise their strengths and perhaps build up on their opportunities to give of their best at work. So, like all the other sessions, if you've got questions or comments or observations, please type them in the question box on the right-hand side, and I'll respond to those as soon as possible. Bear in mind, of course, I'm the only one that gets to see those questions, and of course I'll respond to them as soon as we can. That way it doesn't leave an awkward pause at the end of the presentation when you're waiting, or I'm waiting for you to type in your question. So the moment you think of it, type it in. You'll also receive a copy of these slides, and you'll also receive a copy of the recording at the conclusion of today, hopefully this afternoon. That would be the aim of the exercise at least. All right, so let's get underway. So we have covered a number of topics, and I'll just go through those briefly in the Lunch and Learn series. We started out several weeks ago looking at the ingredients of effective feedback, and my point there was that you should be giving feedback on a regular basis, project by project, moment by moment, incident by incident. That feedback can be positive or negative depending on the circumstances, but I gave you a few of the important ingredients in terms of giving effective feedback. In session 2, we looked at influencing capabilities, and the point I was trying to make there, of course, was that we need to be flexible in terms of how we influence people. And in fact, there are 3 variables involved in any influencing situation. There's your own profile, which of course you completed as a starting point for that particular unit. And then the next thing is to be aware that other people have their own profile. So even though they haven't completed the influencing capabilities profile, they still have a way of looking at things. They still have a predisposition to how they want to be influenced. And it's important to try to understand that you can't always get that right. And as a result of that, we suggest that you try a plan A and a plan B, and if they don't work, try a plan C and indeed a plan D if you need to. But we looked at 4 influencing strategies during that session. The last time we met, of course, we looked at optimizing team performance, and really what I was promoting there was the whole notion of one-on-one communication and the need for you to have regular check-ins with your team members, and that those regular check-ins make a huge difference in terms of connecting with people. And as colleagues of mine said, Kusner and Posner, leadership is indeed a relationship, not a personal relationship, of course, but a professional working relationship. And the critically important thing is that you can only have a working relationship, or any relationship for that matter, one conversation at a time. And so that's where we get to Unit 4 today, which is, of course, the ability to get the best out of the people we lead. And I won't cover the other 2 until we get to that point. So the important thing, I think, is that when you distill it all down, your job ultimately, or your primary role as a leader, is to get the very best from the people you lead. And that is not an easy task. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get everyone at 100% efficiency, but you may be able to increase their efficiency by 10%, and often that's enough. So in fact, if you've got 5 people in your team and you can increase each of their performance by 10% by trying a few things that I suggest today, then you've clearly got a 50% improvement in your team, and that's significant. So it's not about getting everyone to 100%, but it's at least getting them to a point where they've improved their performance in a marginal way, and of course that makes a big difference overall. So I would argue that that's your primary aim or primary role as a team leader. Now, what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at some of the myths around motivation, and the fact is there are lots of myths about motivating. The obvious myth is that you can't actually motivate anybody. It's their choice about whether they become motivated. And so all we can do as a leader is to create the right environment for people to choose to be motivated. So that becomes really important to be able to create that right environment. So what do people want in their job? I want to give you some research that was conducted a while ago by Harvard Business School, and they interviewed 9,000 people and they simply asked them the question, what's the most important thing in your work? And what I've done here is I'm going to give you the top 10 items. I wonder if you can guess what they are. Some of them will surprise you, but the important thing is that if you're meeting most of those needs, if indeed not all of them, it's likely that you're going to create the environment by which people ultimately decide to become motivated. We're going to look at the concept of job and non-job roles. And of course, job roles are what's on the job description, and they're the easy part, really. It's the non-job roles that become elusive and interesting, and they're not normally included on the job description. So we'll want to have a look at some of those because they have a huge impact on performance. In fact, it's another dimension of performance that we'll look at. And then I'm going to share with you some models of motivation. Many of you would have seen these models before, but I'm going to share with you the reputable ones and perhaps talk about the implications of how you might use them in terms of getting the best from the people that you lead. And then we're done. I'll obviously set you some homework as I normally do, and it'll give you an opportunity to practice some of the things that you've learnt throughout. Okay, so that's where we're going for the next 50 minutes or so. So let's understand what motivation is, because I think sometimes we lose sight of what motivation actually is. And I know this is a busy slide, but you'll notice that there are 3 dimensions, if you like, to motivation. First of all, if you read the summary in the middle there, and I'll just go through that. So motivation are the forces within an individual that account for the level, direction and persistence of effort expended at work. So that's my definition of motivation. And there are 3 dimensions, as I mentioned, and so let's go through those dimensions. So next time you come across somebody that you believe isn't motivated, demotivated, you might, instead of just making the generalization that they're demotivated, you might actually consider where they're demotivated. Is it the direction? Is it the persistence? Or is it the level? So direction is a person's choice about where they spend their time, where they spend their energy. So this is, of course, focus. This is about priorities. And of course, we've all worked with people who clearly are not working on what they should be working on at the time. So under this definition, it would mean that the direction element of motivation is missing. And of course, you can rectify that by explaining to them that this project here needs to be worked on and to park the one that they're working on at the moment. So the where people spend their energy and their time and their direction has to be a critically important part of motivation. And secondly, the second dimension is persistence. How persistent are they at sticking to the task at hand? Obviously, if people give up fairly easily, then you could argue that they don't meet this criteria of persistence in motivation. So we're looking for people, of course, who've got stickability, people who will see it through to the end. So the degree to which people are prepared to work until they get the report done or the job done or the project done, that's the definition there of motivation in terms of persistence. And the final one is the level. That is the level of intensity they put into the work. So you can have someone that's got a clear direction. You can have someone that will stick at it to the end, but they're very slow. So the level of intensity, that is the amount of effort that they put in, is critically important to motivation. Now, this is important because if you think about it, it's either the direction, the persistence, or the level of intensity that make up the term motivation. So next time you're looking at someone who's demotivated, you might like to consider which of those three things are missing. So that's my definition of motivation, and we need to start from that point before we talk about other things in relation to motivation. What I want to do now is share with you some of the myths around motivation, as I mentioned earlier, because there are a lot of myths about motivation. And I think that we need to demystify those and try and understand what we're actually dealing with. The first myth is that, as I mentioned earlier, you can't actually motivate anybody. It's their choice. People make their decision about being motivated. The only thing that you and I can do is to create the environment by which people become motivated. But ultimately, it's their choice about whether they decide or not to become motivated. So it's an inside job. And this was very liberating for me as a leader, because once I found out that I couldn't motivate people, I could relax a little bit and understand that all I could do was create the right circumstances and environment for them to decide to become motivated. And that's all you can do. And ultimately, it's their decision. So, for example, you can do the same thing for two people. One becomes motivated, one doesn't. Ultimately, the decision is left with them as to whether they become motivated or not. So that's a myth, that we can't actually run around motivating people. We can only create the circumstances. The second myth about motivation is that everyone actually is motivated to an extent, but not everyone's inspired. Just getting out of bed this morning is a motivation. And for us to make sweeping statements that that person isn't motivated and that one is wrong. So ultimately, everybody has a degree of motivation. The question we've got to try and do, of course, is tap into what that is. So that becomes very, very important. And I mention that to you because if you can imagine, just fictitiously, of course, if you've got a body of water where you are, and you took what you perceive to be the most demotivated person in your team out into the middle of the water, and you grab them by the scruff of the neck and you push their head underwater, you'll find that they will fight like anything to come to the surface. In other words, they're going to be motivated to survive. So we're all motivated. It's just a question of whether we're inspired or not. The third dimension that needs to be dispelled is that, well, it's a truism actually. Motivation is subjective. So what motivates you and what motivates me is not necessarily what motivates everybody else. And I found this is very interesting, that people have got a variety of different motivations and they come to work with a whole range. Those motivations will change with age, they'll change with experience, they'll change with jobs, they'll change with circumstances. Our job is to try to understand, as much as we possibly can, what actually makes people tick. And it is a big mistake, and it's a very common mistake, for leaders to try to motivate people according to their own level of motivation, or whatever it is that they're motivated by. So, for example, if I'm motivated by status, I might think that everybody's motivated by status, but that's not necessarily the case. Or if I'm motivated by an altruistic concern, like looking after homeless youth or people who are not so well off, I might assume that everybody is motivated by that, but it's not necessarily the case. So we need to understand that motivation is a very subjective topic. The fourth myth is that internal motivation is far more powerful than extrinsic motivation. You might say, well, what do you mean by intrinsic and extrinsic? Intrinsic meaning internal, extrinsic meaning external. And of course, what our workplace does is we have all sorts of rewards and recognition for people, and we use extrinsic motivation to try to motivate people. That's not a good thing to do necessarily, because after a while, those extrinsic motivational sources are no longer effective. So what we've got to try and do is tap into people's human spirit and work, because ultimately that is the sustainable motivator. And so we need to try to get people to be motivated from within, rather than using what we call carrot and stick to get people to be motivated. The fifth one is that money is often overestimated as a motivational force. Now, obviously, money's important. We all need to live. We all need to pay for the things that we use. So I'm not suggesting that money isn't a motivator. I'm just simply making the point that it's far more, it is highly overestimated, because we hear people complaining that they don't get paid enough. They complain that there's not enough dollar at the end of the month, and so forth. So we hear this all the time, and we make the assumption that money is the most important motivator. It's not. And research has clearly showed that. Some of the work that Frederick Hertzberg has done has clearly shown that money is not necessarily the most important motivator. For example, if you paid people twice as much, if you could wave a wand and all of a sudden everyone got double the salary that they're getting now, this wouldn't necessarily mean that people would increase their level of effort by twice. Not at all. So it's important that we understand that money can only go so far. And after a while, it is not necessarily a motivational force. And finally, people are motivated by two guiding principles, and Anthony Robbins talks about this in his great book, Awaken the Giant Within, that people are motivated by two principal forces, pain and pleasure. So what people do is they tend to gravitate away from pain or towards pleasure. And that's such a simplistic concept, but what's interesting about that is that we all interpret pain and pleasure in different ways. So for example, if two of us are at traffic lights in two separate cars going to the same meeting, one would be very stressed because they're late, and the other person would just chill out and listen to some music and wait for the lights to turn green. The same thing's happening to them, but one interprets it as painful, being late to the meeting, whereas the other one is not too concerned. So we conceptualize pain and pleasure differently, but ultimately we seek our pleasure and we avoid pain, and ultimately we can dumb down everything to be the primary motivators of pain and pleasure. So, folks, there are some of the key myths, if you like, about motivation that I wanted to dispel before we moved any further. Now, getting to these 10 qualities that people want in their job. So you might be very interested in what these qualities are, and you might be surprised. And what I'd like you to do when I'm going through these 10, and this was a very simple piece of research that was done by Harvard. You'll notice it's been done quite a few years ago, but nevertheless, I don't think things have changed that much. So as I go through this list, I'd like you to think about which of these things are the things that motivate you. Not everything will. Some will be more important than others. But ultimately what happened is that 9,000 people were interviewed. They were asked to indicate what their number one motivator was in the workplace. All of that information was collected. And what you're going to see is a frequency model here where the number one item on the list was the thing that was mentioned most frequently. Number two, the second most frequent, and so forth right through to 10. So here they are. I wonder if you can guess what number one is. All right. So number one is to work for efficient managers. Now that's pretty interesting, isn't it? That people want to work for efficient managers. And in fact, if you've ever done any exit interviewing, which is talking to people after they've made a decision to leave to work somewhere else, and you said, what's the real reason you're leaving? People are quite honest in those sorts of circumstances because they've got nothing to lose. People will often tell you it's because they've got a very poor relationship or have had a poor relationship with their manager. And that's the ultimate reason that they're moving on when they've got options. So being an effective manager is hugely important to people. And so obviously the Lunch and Learn series is about helping you become a more effective leader. And if you become a more effective leader, then you're probably fulfilling what most people would consider what they really want as a quality in their work, to work for an effective leader. Number 2 on the list is that people want to think for themselves. Now, some of you might say, well, I wish some of my people did think for themselves. Well, the truth of the matter is people want autonomy. They want to be able to make their own choices about how they do their work. They want to make choices about what they work on first. They want to make choices about who they collaborate with. People need and want that freedom. And you might be saying to yourself, well, I wish some of my people did show a little bit more autonomy. But ultimately, that's the number 2 one on the list. So what we've got to do is explain to people what the end game is, what the ultimate target is, give people the resources they need to complete the job, and let them get on and do it in their own way. Now, if we do that, we've fulfilled the second most important quality on the list. Number 3. Number 3 is that people want to see an end result. Now, this is not easy in some industries, because and much easier in others. So, for example, in the not-for-profit sector, if we're working in a project that looks after homeless youth, then obviously we can see the benefits of that, because we can see that we're actually fulfilling needs that we feel very strongly about. I did a little bit of research several years ago in a local government environment here in Australia, and I simply went out to the outdoor staff and I asked them on a scale of 1 to 10 how they'd rate their job satisfaction. Now, I did the same thing for the internal staff, and I compared the 2 results. And what I found was, and I was a little surprised by this, that the outdoor staff had a higher level of motivation than the indoor staff, by quite an appreciable margin. And I asked some outdoor staff members why they rated it as they did. So, for example, if they rated their level of motivation at 7 out of 10, I asked the question why. And the common response I got back is that people said to me that they can see the work that they've done. They can see the bridge that's been fixed. They can see the pothole that's been filled. They can see the fence that's been erected, or they can see the vegetation that's been cleared. So the end result was very tangible. And so that obviously gave people a sense of accomplishment. So in an office environment, our challenge is to try to link and create a line of sight between what people are doing and the ultimate outcome. So if someone's filling out a report and completing a report that they might find quite mundane and tedious, our job is to explain to them 2 things. 1, what the benefits of doing the report right are, and 2, the pitfalls of not doing the report right. So we as managers have got to spend more time basically explaining the why of work, as Simon Sinek talks about. So that's number 3 on the list. Number 4 on the list is that people want to be assigned interesting work. People want meaning in their life, and if we spend a third of our life in the workplace, then people want to feel as if they're challenged. They want to feel as if they're growing in their work. Not everybody, of course, but this was number 4 on the list. So, of course, we want to give people an opportunity to grow and develop on the job. And so we need to be conscious of delegating to people interesting assignments that they can get on and do. And if we do that, we've got a reasonable chance of fulfilling that quality that people want in their work. Number 5, people want to be informed. What do they want to be informed about? Well, they want to be informed about 2 things ultimately. The direction of the organisation. So where is the organisation heading? What are the new things that are going to be done? They want to be told that. They also want to know how they're going in their job. They want to know about their job. They want feedback on performance, as I mentioned in Unit 1. They want to know how they're travelling. So this is again something that managers often don't do, and I often hear and I see in surveys that people complain that they're not being kept informed. So we as leaders need to keep people informed. Number 6 on the list. Number 6 on the list is to be listened to. People genuinely want their leader to listen to them. They don't necessarily want them to agree with them, but they do want them to listen to them. That means not interrupting them, hearing them out, giving them the time, paraphrasing what they've said. They want to feel that their boss is genuinely listening to them. Now, of course, this isn't easy either, because obviously, in some cases, the last 6 things that person said were fairly predictable. So why wouldn't the number 7 be the same? So we tune out. And of course, our brain works much faster than our voice. So we're on to the next thing while that person's trying to articulate to us a key point that they want to make in the workplace. But nevertheless, people want to be listened to, and that's fair and reasonable. So we need to spend more time listening to people. Number 7 on the list, people want to be respected. Remember, the people that work for you are people who happen to be workers. They're not workers who happen to be people, and there's a big difference. So we need to respect their fundamental rights as human beings. Doesn't again mean we have to like them. We don't have to be best friends with anybody. We just need to respect them, and we need to give them the opportunity to feel that they are respected, to treat them with a sense of dignity in the workplace. And that's number 7 on the list. Remember, this is not something I've made up. This is 9,000 people who have clearly articulated what it is that they want in their work. Number 8 on the list is to be recognised for their effort. People want to be given an opportunity to perform, and when they do perform, they want to be given the opportunity to feel that their efforts have been recognised. Again, this is not monetary. It's just simply a recognition. Just saying thank you to people is often a recognition. And of course, we don't say thank you enough in the workplace. So people just want to feel that their boss has recognised the work that they've done. So it's not difficult, this one. Number 9 on the list is people want to feel challenged. They want to grow and stretch, not to be over-challenged, but to actually be stimulated in their work. They want to feel that they're given an opportunity to be able to challenge themselves. Now, again, everyone's threshold's different on this. For one person, that threshold might be very low. For another person, it might be very high. But the truth is that people want to feel a sense of recognition, and they want to feel a sense of challenge in the work that they do. And last but not least, number 10 on the list, and this was the cutoff here, is that people want to feel as if they're increasing their opportunity to develop in the work that they do. So they want to feel a sense that they are building their skill level up, that they are growing in the job that they're doing, and that they have more skills than when they started in the job. So that's why training and development is such a big deal in workplaces. People want to feel that they're continually growing and developing, and not everybody is in this frame, but most people are. So they're the 10 things that people want out of their work. So the question for you is, which of those 10 things do you feel most strongly about in terms of your own work? And bear in mind, though, if you're doing all those 10 things or making a genuine effort to be applying most of those 10 things, then you're creating, as I said earlier, a motivational environment that people can fulfill in, that people may choose to become motivated. So those 10 things are critically important. So that gives you a little bit of a framework to consider how you might get the best from the people that you lead. So I have a question for you, and the question is this: if you have one person who's just not motivated, what do you do? What do you do? So this person, you've tried this, you've tried that, you've given it your best shot, and quite frankly, they're just not motivated. So what do you have to do? Well, the answer is simple. Ask them. Just ask them. Ask them what you can do, and this might be the way you might phrase it. You might say, is there anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you to be more engaged in your work? Now, you may not get the answer that you want, but it's worth asking the question because you're showing respect. You're considering how you might change your approach based on the information you receive from the other person. So just ask. It's often a good thing to do that. The other thing is, of course, just to observe people and to understand what makes them tick. Spend a bit of time with them in the lunchroom. You know, before you launch into your work in the morning, spend a bit of time walking around, talking to people. Find out what makes them tick. Try to instill that in the work, in your leadership style and the way you deal with people. So that's a simple thing that you can do. Now, you won't always get the answer you want, but at least you should ask the question. You never know, people may give you something very interesting to deal with. And of course, if it's reasonable, then you go ahead and do it. And by doing it, of course, you're going to create a more motivational environment. Now, I want to share with you a model that I presented in one of my books, The End of the Job Description, and I really want to talk about two dimensions of performance. Now, one of the dimensions of performance you'd be very familiar with, and that is, of course, the technical dimension of what people do in the workplace. And as I mentioned earlier, this is what's on their job description. But there's a whole other dimension that's often neglected and not considered, and yet it can make all the difference in the world as to whether or not people are actually excelling at work. So let's have a look at how it works. If you consider the work that people do, there is one dimension of work, which is, of course, the job role. So everyone at work has a job, and they're required to complete that job using a number of technical skills and completing a certain number of tasks. And normally that's written up in a work document that we call a job description. Now, that's the easy part, actually, because most of those technical skills and tasks have got key performance indicators. I mean, it's very easy to determine whether or not people are fulfilling their job role. You just have to observe them and give feedback where they're not, achieving results. So, but what about the other dimension that I mentioned earlier? This is the dimension of non-job roles. Now, academics for the last 25 years have been trying to determine a set of non-job roles that are applicable across all industries, and they've been fumbling around with this for quite a long time. So I decided in the book to identify what I considered to be 4 non-job roles that are critically important for all 21 industries which I work across. And I challenge you to consider these non-job roles in relation to the work that you do. I suspect that these non-job roles are critically important in the work that you do. So let's have a look at them. One of the non-job roles is to have a positive attitude and enthusiasm. Now, I'm not expecting people to come to work bouncing off the walls. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't expect people, on the other hand, to come to work whinging, bitching, moaning, undermining, passing the buck, all of these sorts of behaviours that we see in the workplace. In my mind, they're symptomatic of a poor attitude. And I think it's fair and reasonable that we as leaders should be really saying to people, we expect you to come to work with a decent attitude. And we expect you to come to work with a solution focus, not a problem focus. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. And what's interesting about this is that you and I could be observing a person, and I'll guarantee we'd both come to the same conclusion about whether that person had a positive or a negative attitude, or somewhere in between. So it's not hard to observe. And again, what you should be using is critical incidents. So you use a critical incident to demonstrate what you're happy with and what you're not happy with. So, for example, if someone made a very positive contribution in a team meeting, then obviously that's an opportunity for you to give positive feedback. On the other hand, if somebody in that same meeting was negative about 3 or 4 different proposals that were put up, then that would be 3 or 4 examples or critical incidents where you could actually say to that person, we expect you to at least listen and to at least bite your tongue until it bleeds and allow the person to elaborate on their idea or their thought without you jumping in, giving your negative feedback. So having a positive attitude is critically important. Could you imagine if everyone in your team had a negative attitude? That is going to affect performance negatively, of course. The second role, non-job role, if you like, is the team role. We expect everybody to be a team player. That's part and parcel of the 21st century workplace. Hierarchy is now less, is diminished. We're expecting people to work cross-functionally. We expect people to work in different teams at different times on different projects. So we expect people to be team players. And I don't think it's negotiable if someone says to you, well, I'm not really a team player. I'm just an individual. I come to work and do my thing. I actually don't think that's really appropriate. Regardless of how good their technical skills are, we all expect people to work together in teams. And I think, again, you can use critical incidents to point out positive teamwork and negative teamwork. And you should hold people accountable for being team players. So that's the second non-job role that I think is critically important that affects performance. The third non-job role I call a career role. Now, a career role really is about people growing and developing in their role. So we expect people, I think, to continually upgrade and upskill themselves in their current work. And if we don't have that expectation, then of course people get left behind because the world is changing so quickly. So we expect people to grow and develop and to upgrade their skill set. And of course, as I said earlier, that's one of the top 10 expectations that people have of work. But of course, not everyone's like that, and we expect people to continually grow and develop. And I think that's a fair and reasonable expectation that you've got of people at work. And number four, whereas number three is working on themselves, number four is working on the organisation or the workforce. So we expect people to come to work, bring their ideas to work with them, to consider how they can make the workplace a better place to work in. It's not just your job, it's everyone's job in the team. So that's a non-job role. And none of those four things that I've just mentioned are probably listed on your job description. And because they're not listed on your job description, it's quite possible that those things are being left out. So you can see that they become critically important adjuncts to performance. And I actually talk about developing role descriptions in the book that's down the bottom there. I talk about the need that we need to move away from job descriptions towards role descriptions. And I talk about shifting from a job focus to a performance focus. And in order to move to a performance focus, we need to incorporate those two dimensions, the job and the non-job dimensions. And they're critically important. And of course, people think, oh, well, I can't really talk to people about these non-job roles because they're not really objective. As I said earlier, we all know we've all got our own expectations and we know what's going well and what's not going well in terms of those non-job roles. Our job is to give feedback about that. Now, what I want to do now is finish up with some of the reputable motivational theories that are out there. And as I said earlier, there's probably many of these that you've come across in your time and your studies. But I want to talk also about their application in the workplace. Now, Abraham Maslow, who was an industrial psychologist in the 20th century, came up with what he termed Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's an interesting story about this. He actually was in a restaurant and drew this up on a table napkin, and he became subsequently quite embarrassed about how incredibly popular the model became. The big weakness of the model is it hasn't been empirically tested. But I think it makes perfect sense to us all what these levels of hierarchy are. Now, what Maslow argues is that once one need has been met, it no longer becomes a motivational force. In other words, there's a higher level need that comes into play. So if you start at the bottom, the first and most fundamental need of human beings is physiological. That is, we human beings need air, food and water to survive. And that is our primary focus. So if people haven't got air, food and water, they're not interested in anything else but making sure they can breathe, making sure they've got some food, and making sure um, they have some water. These are the critically important things. So in war-torn parts of the world, people simply are trying to survive on the basis of physiological needs before anything else kicks in. So that's important. So fortunately, in our part of the world, that's not a problem. People normally come to work with having eaten breakfast and ready to go, and they've just lived in a house and they've got shelter. So that's not something that we can do much about as a leader, nor should we even consider as a leader. Now, the next key thing is once air, food and water or physiological needs are met, is that we need to feel safe. There's two ways that we want to feel safe, physically and psychologically. Now, physical safety means that we want to feel that we're not going to be injured at work, that we're not going to be assaulted. And of course, there are laws in place for both of those things. And so our workplaces need to be safe from a physical point of view. But there is another sort of safety that's still rife in the workplace, and that's psychological. And that is that bullying and harassment and all of those sorts of things that we hear so much about in the media today, and rightly so, is a critically important need that we have as human beings. We need to feel that we're safe, both physically and psychologically. Now, once that safety need's been met, the next level of safety that we need is we need to feel a sense of belonging. So we need to feel that we're part of the show. So when someone joins your workforce or your team, their ultimate or their initial insecurity is, do I belong? Have I got an important contribution to make? Will it be recognised? So the important thing that is often overlooked is that when we want to get opinions about how we change our workplace, we often ask people that have been there for 10, 15 years. In actual fact, the people to ask are the people who have only been there for 5 minutes. People who are new to the team often don't have blinkers on and can actually look at things in a different way. And of course, they've had experiences beyond the team in other workplaces. So it's important for us to ask them what their opinion is or what their attitude is. So asking people their opinion and making them feel that they're a valued member of the team. The other important thing is, of course, contractors. People who are contractors, that is, people who might come in on a part-time basis or once every now and again, probably need more fulfillment in terms of belonging than someone that's a permanent employee, because they may feel that they're just sort of part-time. So we need to bring them into the tent, so to speak. So that's important for you to think about in terms of the workplace. Once that's been accomplished, the next big challenge that we have is that people want to feel that they have a self-esteem or they've accomplished things. They want to feel that they themselves are important. And this is done through accomplishment and praise and positive reinforcement and those sorts of things. So we need to build up people's self-esteem. We need to let them know when we're happy. We need to let them know where the line in the sand is. Those things are critically important. Now, if we've done that effectively, we've fulfilled two critically important needs in the workplace: a sense of belonging and a sense of self-esteem. And if those needs have been met, there's a higher need that is important, and that's the need of self-actualization. That's what Maslow called it, self-actualization. That is the need to grow and develop continually in the work that we do. And of course, by providing people with challenging assignments, giving people an opportunity to complete learning and development programs, All of these things, of course, nourish the self-actualization need. Now, the key thing for you in all of this is to look at people and consider, is this a belonging issue? Is this a self-esteem issue? Or is this a self-actualization issue? And then, of course, fulfilling that need in that individual at that time. And if you can do that, you're fulfilling an important need according to Maslow. And then that need gets superseded by another need as we go up the ladder. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, although it hasn't been empirically tested, has got a lot of face validity to it. I'm sure you could see the common sense in it. Okay, another model that is quite popular, in fact, I'd have to say it's probably underrated, is Douglas McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y. Now, there's a lot of detail on the screen here, but ultimately what he's basically saying is that leaders can be put into two camps, Theory X or Theory Y. So a Theory X leader is somebody that believes that people are inherently lazy, that need direction, they need to be pushed, they're often motivated by fear, and they don't really have much creativity. So a Theory X manager, of course, is going to be a certain type of leader. And if any of you have worked for a Theory X manager, and hopefully you're not at the moment, but if you have, you'd know, you'd remember it well. There's nothing more demotivating because that person's making assumptions that are often incorrect about your level of motivation and their need to be a micromanager. All right, so Theory Y managers are, I hope you're a Theory Y manager in a genuine sense, but Theory Y managers believe that people believe that work is fundamentally important, that people are self-directed, given the right resources, they'll get on and do the job, that people can show creativity and resourcefulness when it's needed, and they can get on and do the job. And so a Theory Y manager has a completely different way of leading. Now, the model's a little bit simplistic because it's probably true to say that many people are a combination of Theory X and Theory Y, and we're not really one of the two camps. But ultimately, it's a nice way of being able to look at the way managers view human nature. So this is a great theory because it considers human nature as the critically important determinant of motivation. And of course, a person can move from a Theory X to a Theory Y and vice versa, but normally they're pretty stuck in their ways. And you would know what I mean from the experiences that you've had being led by a Theory X and a Theory Y manager. So that's another theory you might like to consider. Now, lately, there's a brilliant book called Drive by Daniel Pink. And in Drive, Daniel Pink makes a very strong point. He argues that the carrot and the stick, that is, reward and punishment, are no longer effective motivators, extrinsic motivators, in our world. He argues this is particularly the case for what he calls knowledge workers, or white-collar workers, or people who've got a degree or some expertise in some area. He argues that using external incentives and punishment is actually counterproductive, and I agree with him. He argues that people working in a production area, on the other hand, may find the carrot and the stick quite a useful approach, but not for people who want to think for themselves. He actually argues that there are three key determinants of getting the best out of a knowledge worker. And I know most of you in this Lunch and Learn series are working with knowledge workers. He argues that people should be given autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is that people need to be able to exercise some free thinking in terms of how they do their work. And of course, this links in very nicely with the top 10 qualities that people want in their work. So people want to be able to make their own decisions about the work that they're doing and how they go about it. And that's fair enough. They also want to feel that they're making some headway and they're mastering the skill sets that they need to do the work. So people require opportunities to learn and grow. They need learning and development opportunities that are practical and are basically are going to help them improve their skill set. And finally, people need to know the why of work, what, as I mentioned earlier, Simon Sinek talks about. The why of work talks about what the real reason, what's the core purpose of the work that I'm asking you to do. So when we complete this task, what is the ultimate aim of this? So giving people a line of sight between the work they do and the ultimate outcome is critically important. So you might want to keep those three things in mind, and you might want to grab his book Drive, which is a great read. And he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So let's just sum all of this up. Ultimately, if you're doing these things, you're likely to create the environment by which people will ultimately become motivated. So let's start up at the top left-hand corner, and we need to be very crystal clear of clarifying the task role. So what is it that you're expecting people to do? What does the end result look like? What will you be happy with? And what is the minimum acceptable standard of performance? You need to spend a little bit more time explaining to people what that looks like. As I've mentioned earlier, you need to be giving regular, consistent, and specific feedback to people, both positive and negative. People need to understand how they're travelling in their work. So that becomes critically important. So if you've dropped the ball on the feedback since Unit 1, pick it up again and run with it. 3, you need to show people how they're making a contribution. And this comes back to what Daniel Pink was talking about purpose. We need to give people a line of sight between the work they're doing and the ultimate outcome. And if we do that, then people will see the big picture. And likely they may choose to become motivated, or at least not demotivated. We need to encourage personal goal clarification. We need to give people enough autonomy to make up their own mind about the sorts of work that they need to do. So we need to help them with that. And wherever possible, we need to match their job with their personal motives. So this is what we call strength-based leadership. So we need to be able to work with what people's innate talents are and how they might be best utilised in their current working environment. And the more we do that, the more joy it brings to their work. And the more joy it brings to their work, the more energy there is. And the more energy, the more likely they are to be motivated or engaged. We need to make apparent what the personal gains for personal and productivity are. So again, this is around the need to give people a sense of purpose. We need to explain what the ultimate aim of the job is and what we're trying to achieve. We need to recognise individual success. As I said earlier, just saying thank you to people is often enough. No one's ever going to accuse you of stop saying thank you. They're not even going to say, I don't want you to tell me, I don't want you to thank me anymore. You just basically do that as a way of showing that person that you respect, not only them, but what they do. As a leader, you've got to remove the organisational roadblocks. And of course, there are many. And your job, wherever possible, is to acknowledge what those roadblocks are, and then do what you can to remove them, because ultimately that's your job as a leader. And of course, there are removing supervisory roadblocks as well. That is you. Okay, so this is about what roadblocks are you putting in the way? Are you a micromanager, for example? Are you expecting unrealistic things from the team? Are you being too demanding? Are you a difficult or unapproachable person? All of those things are roadblocks that you need to remove, because you remember what the number one quality that people want in their work, and that was to work for a leader that was effective and efficient. And that's ultimately what you've got to try and do throughout this Lunch and Learn series. So folks, that's pretty much it for me, and we're almost towards the end, and I've just got to set you a little bit of homework, of course, and I simply want you to go out of here today and try this. I'd like you to use autonomy, mastery, and purpose in your leadership decision making and your conversations, and stick to it no matter what. I'd like you to try to create a style of leadership that exhibits a sense of autonomy, that encourages people to grow and develop, and ultimately explains to people what the end game is or what you're trying to achieve. Now, if you do these things, it's likely that you're going to create the environment, as I mentioned, where knowledge workers will in fact make a decision to become motivated. So I want you to take a good hard look in the mirror and say, am I doing these three things? And if I am, how much more can I do? And how can I do that? So folks, that's it from me today. And just coming back to the last slide, next time we meet, which is 2 weeks away, we're going to look at understanding people and their personalities. And I've got a diagnostic for you, a second one, which is a paper and pencil one this time, and I'll get you to complete it. I'll send this out to you probably this afternoon, but if not, it'll be early next week, and I'll get you to complete that diagnostic, and so that you're ready. So when we hit the ground in 2 weeks' time, I can debrief you on what that diagnostic means and and how it relates to your own personality. And then ultimately, the last unit will look at how we might manage effective meetings, because really that's critically important for a leader, is to be able to manage their meetings and create more interest and more engagement in your team meetings. So folks, that's it from me. I want to wish you a very safe and enjoyable weekend, and I'm always keen to hear from you via email. But what I'd like to do now is to leave you with that challenge and give you an opportunity